Otherwise, if everybody will go to this sheet in your book or in your hands, whichever the case may be, this is our class plan. There are dates on here as well. And I think we're going to stick pretty close to that, okay? Typically, I fall behind in my classes a little bit. We probably won't fall behind in this class because the material is not as extensive in most of these classes as it usually is. The upside of that is we may actually finish some classes early and we will not start the next, okay? If we finish the class 10 minutes early, I'll just get to sit here and chat for a little while so that we can stay on plan. If we do fall behind, there are a couple of topics there at the end. If you'll look down at the bottom, understanding apocalyptic literature, two influential writers, Philo and Josephus. If we have to drop anything out, we'll drop those out, okay? Otherwise, if you kind of look down the topic list, you're going to have an idea what we're doing. Jews in Babylon, Jews under Persian rule, Persia and Greece, Alexander's empire. The Diadochi, there's a lot of history at the beginning of the class. There's a lot of history in the class, period, okay? But as we get then later in the class, when we start talking about the Herods, that's history too, but it's really about understanding some things that's important for the New Testament, particularly some Jewish festivals, Jewish writings of the period, the Jews in Egypt in the Septuagint, Jewish sects, the synagogue, Qumran, and the Dead Sea Scrolls. Those are all topical studies. However, to understand those topical studies, we have to lay down the foundation of the history, which is what the first class is about, all right? So that's what we're going to be doing in the class. If you are sitting here this morning and you're saying, boy, what did I sign up for? This is not the class for me. Let me know, okay? I will not get my feelings hurt. I promise I will not. Well, I might get them a little hurt, but not a whole lot hurt. Let me know and tell me, I really want to go to the Gospel of John, or I want to go to Ed's class. Let me know that, and just give me your book back. No big deal, okay? No harm, no foul. But I would like to know, because if Bethany over here all of a sudden isn't coming to class, I'm going to wonder if I've offended Bethany in some way. And, I'll have to go to her and say, Bethany, did I hurt your feelings or something? And she said, no, I just didn't like your class. In which case my feelings might be hurt a little bit. All right? So just let me know if you decide to go to a different class. No big deal, okay? That's what we're doing in the class. Any questions about that before we get into the slides themselves? And a lot of this, the first slides, I know it says the Jews in Babylon, but we have to do some introductory. So when we talk about the intertestamental period, what period are we talking about? We're talking about the period that stretches from the close of the Old Testament until the beginning of the New. I think probably most of us realize that between the book of Malachi and the book of Matthew, there's a period of roughly 400 years where there's no inspired revelation. So nothing's going on between Malachi and Matthew as far as inspired, all right? You have the close of the Old Testament, you have the beginning of the New Testament. Well, that's a very significant 400-year period. So, for example, what languages is the Old Testament written in? Raise your hand if you know. You don't have to have a mic, call it out loud. Languages of the Old Testament. Aaron, give me one. Hebrew, says Aaron. How about the other language that is the language of the Old Testament? This is more obscure. Anybody know that one? Greek. Not Greek, not Arabic. Aramaic, okay? Aramaic is the other language. You wouldn't know that unless you spoke those languages, because in the Hebrew Old Testament, they're all written in the same script. But those who understand the difference, and I'm not one of them, between Hebrew and Aramaic, would recognize that there is a shift, that there are some sections that are written in a different language, even if they're written in the same alphabet, okay? But then you get to the New Testament. What language is the New Testament written in? I've already heard the correct answer just for the wrong question. Greek is the language of the New Testament. Whoa, what happened? Greek is a completely different language than Hebrew, Aramaic, all right? Completely different language from a completely different part of the world. I know it's still the Mediterranean, but it's still a different part of the world. What happened in that period? Okay, Alexander and some other things. That's what we're going to talk about in this class. How did we get from Hebrew to Greek, and what's that all about? How did we get to the difference in thinking? How did we get the Romans on the scene? Because when the Old Testament closes, who's in control over, who's exercising authority over the Jews? Persia is. When the New Testament opens, who's exercising control over the Jews? The Romans are. But in between, there is a very significant stretch of world history. So we're going to be talking about that. The period of the Intertestament is usually considered to be about 400 BC to 4 BC, okay? 4 BC being the coming of Christ. If you want to know how it is possible that Jesus is born in 4 BC, which stands for before Christ, come to the lecture on December the 13th, because 14th. December the 14th. Got to get that date right, because we're going to talk about that, how we end up with 4 BC instead of, he should have been born in 0, right? The year 0. Who do y'all think, how many of y'all think Jesus should have been born in the year 0? Raise your hand. Get some hands out there. There is no 0. That is exactly right. There is 1 BC and 1 AD. There is no year 0. Okay? So it is an interesting turn of events on our calendar that we have Jesus born in 4 BC. We'll talk about that in the lecture. Not going to spend time in that here in the class except to mention it. That's roughly the intertestamental period. However, for the purposes of this class, we're going to expand the period to include this period, the beginning of the Babylonian captivity, and we're going to end it with the Jews under Roman control. We're going to stretch it a little bit. We're going to go back about 100 years. We're going to go forward about 100 years to cover all of these topics that we don't normally cover in a Bible class, okay? And certainly all of that intertestamental period we don't cover, okay? If you're going through the Bible, if you're going through the biblical study, you finish with the minor prophets, you finish with Malachi, and then if you jump into the very next study, it's going to be New Testament Gospels, right? Probably the Synoptic Gospels that Phil just taught. And when you do that, the world has changed. We're going to catch that period in between the two, all right? Why is this important? Why is this important? Because it spans the changes between those two books that we talked about. There are significant cultural, religious, and political changes. There are changes among the Jews, okay, that we need to talk about as we go through the class. That's one reason that allows us to understand better what's going on in the New Testament. So, for example, who in the world is Herod when Jesus is born? Who is Herod, and where did he come from? We don't read about any Herods in the Old Testament. And now we've got this guy named Herod. Well, he was called Herod. Everybody else called him Herod the Great. Okay, they called him other things too, just not to his face. Herod the Great. He's running the show. And then later in the New Testament, we get another Herod. Who are these people? We're going to talk about that in the class. Not something we usually talk about in a biblical class. So one reason is we're going to cover all of that. And it's a lot, okay? It's not just the history, but it's those topics as well, especially in the latter part of the class. So we have things like the Jewish sects. I'm talking there about who? Pharisees, Sadducees, who else? The Essenes, well, they're not even in the New Testament at all, but we're going to talk about them. Who's our other third group that's talked about in the New Testament? Anybody know? No. Quite the opposite of Herodians. The Zealots, okay? That's the other group, all right? So those are the four main groups of the Jews that are going on in the New Testament, all right? Where did they come from? We'll talk about it. It's all a part of that religious in this case, religious and political changes. The other reason that this is important is because we need to understand the prophecies of Daniel chapter 7 through 12. Daniel is a great book. I love the book of Daniel. Our kids love the book of Daniel because we take Daniel chapters 1 through 6 and we do that with our children, right, in their classes. And then we get to Daniel chapter 7 and what do? We move on to the next topic, whatever that may be. We as adults tend to do that as well. If you're doing your yearly reading program and you're doing the Old Testament, you read Daniel 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Those are great. We know those stories from our youth, and so we love those stories. Preachers love to preach from those stories. And then we get to Daniel chapter 7, and we say, oh, what happened here? I'm reading it, but I have no idea what it is I'm reading about. Daniel chapter 7 through 12 are often misunderstood and often misinterpreted. However, I'm going to suggest to you this morning that if you stick with me in this class, you will have a better understanding of those chapters by the time this class is over, because those chapters deal primarily with what's going on with the Jews in the intertestamental period. So that's why it's important to know the history, okay? So that's another reason why we cover this period. The third reason why we cover this period is to better understand the New Testament itself, because the New Testament comes from a very different cultural, political, and religious background than we find in the Old Testament. And so those 400 years are significant. And if we want to understand the New Testament better, we need to understand what happened in that period. By the way, having a class on the intertestamental period is not at all unusual. If you are studying at a university, it doesn't matter what university. If you were studying at Florida College, I suspect Florida College has it as well. If you were studying at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary here in Fort Worth, you are undoubtedly, if you're getting a degree in theology or Bible, you are undoubtedly going to have a class on the intertestamental period, because it is across the board recognized that we need to understand what's going on in that period to understand the New Testament particularly. I also need to say that when we talk about the intertestamental period, it is not our history. If I say 1492, you say Columbus sailed the ocean blue. If I say 1776, you say Declaration of Independence, okay? That's our history. We're familiar with that. We know the dates. We know the things that are important for us as North Americans and as Americans. But when we talk about the intertestamental period, that's not really our history, but it would have been the history of the Jews of Jesus' day. They would have been familiar with that history, just like I say 1492, I say 1776, I say 1861, I say December 7th, 1941. We all know what those dates mean, okay? So in Jesus' day, the Jews would have been very familiar with this history, with their background, with where they are and how they got there, okay? So it helps us to understand that when we cover that in this class. All right, so what are we going to cover? Lots of history, okay? I try really hard to not make your head hurts, okay? Heads hurt in this. If I can speak English, it will be better. I try not to make it too painful. We try to simplify some things. There will only be one period of history that is just terribly, terribly painful. It's painful for me, okay? Hopefully that day you'll drink an extra cup of coffee in the morning when you come, or if it's Wednesday night, an extra cup of coffee before you come, because there's lots of history that particular class. We'll talk about that later. Most of it I try to keep basic, because it's really about an overview, okay? Briefly, we're going to look at some relevant Bible texts. So Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, all of those books come out of this period, okay? And they describe historical events from this period. More in depth is going to be Daniel 7 through 12. We're going to spend a couple of classes on that. If you look down in your sheets here, you will see January the 1st, January the 5th, Daniel's prophecies of the period, okay? We're going to spend 2 classes looking at those, 6 chapters in Daniel to cover those prophecies, all right? So notice that it is directly after we've covered a lot of the history, but before we get to the Romans, okay? So that's what we're going to be doing in that. I also might point out here, February the 26th, it's in black. That evening there will not be a class. It is a Wednesday night. Do not come to my class. You won't be able to find my class anyways. You can either go to Drew's class or to Ed's class. Exmaybe one of them will have moved into the auditorium. That would not surprise me, to handle the overflow. But that class is a freebie, okay? It's not an extra class to cover what we don't miss, what we don't cover. It is no class, okay? However, that is not permission to stay at home, because we're still having Bible class. Just go to one of the other teachers on February the 26th, and I will remind you of that in advance before we get to that point. All right, so we're going to briefly cover these biblical texts. We're going to look at Jewish non-canonical literature. What in the world is that? That's Jewish writings that are not a part of the Old Testament. The Jews were writing all sorts of stuff, just like Christians were in the 2nd and 3rd century. Writing a whole bunch of stuff that wasn't inspired and therefore wasn't a part of Scripture. We're going to talk about that, or some of that, in this class, and you can look for that. Let's see, where do I have that? January the 26th, January the 29th. It's really interesting stuff, okay? It's really interesting stuff. So we're going to talk about that in the class and try to figure out where this stuff comes from and what it's all about. There are also going to be, as I've already indicated, some various topics that come out of this period and are related to this period. Am I talking too fast for y'all this morning? Okay. I'm trying not to, but I don't want to fall behind first class, because then I look really kind of silly, wouldn't I? All right. So that means that that's all introduction. Bring your books, okay? You have your binders. Bring your binders, okay? If you feel comfortable leaving them here in the auditorium, that's fine. That's up to you. Maybe in the auditorium it'd be better if you took it home, but definitely keep track of your papers and keep your papers up to date. I will say this right now before we go any farther. If you have a binder in your hand, write your name in it, okay? Write your name in it. It's just like in school where the teacher says, here's your book, write your name in it, here's the paper, write your name in it. Because if you leave it here, and somebody says, hey, look, Stephen, we found an extra binder. Who does it belong to? I'm going to say, I have no idea who it belongs to. Unless it belongs to Ivana over there, and I'll know it's hers because she doodles on everything. Okay, so I'll know it will be her book, and I recognize her doodles. But everybody else, write your name on it so that you can find it or somebody can find you if you lose it. Things get misplaced all the time, especially in the auditorium. All right, class-wise, I think that's really all I need to say. Let's go ahead and get into the Neo-Babylonian Empire, or what we'll just say for the purposes of this class, the Babylonian Empire. It's the Neo-Babylonian Empire. It's the New Babylonian Empire because there was an old Babylonian Empire as well that dates way back to the period of the patriarchs. We don't deal with that in this class, one, because it doesn't intersect a whole lot with biblical history, and it certainly doesn't intersect with this history that we're talking about in this class. The Neo-Babylonian Empire exists from 626 to 539 BC. That is a really short time. That is less than 100 years. Less than 100 years for this empire to be the empire in the ancient Near East. They rise to power because there is a power vacuum as Assyria's power wanes. We remember Assyria. We talk about Assyria, especially in the period of the divided kingdom, right? Those guys are really important during that period. But their power is waning, as empires often do, and it is Babylon that's going to be able to come on the scene and take over all of their territory. Okay? In 626 BC, by the way, there will be a test on this at the end of class. Okay? Right? No, I won't do that to you. In 626 BC, Nabopolassar seizes the throne of Babylon. We probably don't talk about Nabopolassar a whole lot. Probably all of us right now are wondering, who in the world is this guy? Well, it's important historically, not important necessarily all that much from the biblical standpoint. In 612 BC, the city of Nineveh, which was one of the capitals of the Assyrian Empire, falls to a coalition of Babylonians, Medes, and Scythians. Hold that thought about Medes till later in the class because they're going to show up again in this story. The Medes are going to link up with someone else later. Scythians, not so much. Don't need to worry about those guys. Just note that they all get together and say, we're tired of the Assyrians. We're going to fight against them. And they do. In 612, they conquer the city of Nineveh. You would think that with the capital city conquered, that would be the end of Assyria. It is not. The Assyrians just kind of keep going a little bit farther to the west to keep their hopes alive. But in 605 BC, at the Battle of Carchemish, Assyrian forces are decisively defeated, and that ends the Assyrian Empire. Okay? And so the Babylonian Empire is dated from about 605 BC because the Assyrians are now gone. In 539 BC, then we have Babylon that had been a part of that coalition actually falls now to a new coalition between the Medes and the Persians. And we've already seen the Medes. Persians are going to be someone new. We'll talk about that, I believe, next class. Okay? I had to look at that real quick. All right? So Babylon falls now to the Medes and the Persians. Do we read about that in the Bible? We do. Anybody know where? Daniel. Oh, you're close, Andrew. Real close. Daniel 5, okay? We read about that in Daniel 5. It's talked about there in the scripture, okay? Babylon falling to these Medes and Persians. All right, let me show a map for y'all. I am going to show maps and photos when I can. There'll be a lot of those in the class. This is a map of the Babylonian Empire. You can see up there north of the Babylonian, and I'm looking back there at that screen and pointing, so I'm not going to turn around, but you can see it behind me. So the Babylonian Empire is in green. Up north of that, you have the Median Empire in gray. They're going to be important then at the end of the period. Persia is pretty much where you see Elam there, Elam in yellow. That's Persia, and some points to the east, okay? Egypt's down there. We don't worry about Egypt too terribly much in this period, at least at the beginning of the period. Lydia up there in Asia Minor. Babylon conquers basically what we would call Mesopotamia, okay, or the Fertile Crescent. That's the area that they conquer. They're going to conquer the Jews as well. I'm sorry? Oh, you're looking at Israel. If I take it, Egypt, Israel, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Turkey, okay? Those are basically the areas that you're looking at on the map today. All right? Okay, so if we look at the city of Babylon itself, it was an extremely old city. It had been around for a very long time. It was a city that had great wealth and great power. Okay? Babylon was kind of the jewel. Everybody wanted Babylon, okay? If you were having an empire in this part of the world, you wanted Babylon, okay? Whether you were Babylonian or not, all right? That's why the Persians eventually are going to take the city of Babylon. It had many temples. It had the Hanging Gardens, okay, which was built by the Babylonian king for his wife, who had come from, I believe she came from Media, where there are more trees than there are in Babylon. Babylon is very flat, okay? Babylon is very flat. And so supposedly he built the Hanging Gardens for his wife. Her name was Amethyst, and it was Nebuchadnezzar, who we're going to talk about, that built those gardens for her. To kind of make her feel more at home, because she liked trees and things like that. Babylon didn't have a whole lot of those, so he did that for her. Nice husband, right? Guys, build a hanging garden for your wife, okay, so that she's happy in wherever she's living. Ivana tells me Texas doesn't have trees, so I plant more in the backyard. It has not worked yet so far, but I'm not done yet, okay? Planting trees and bushes. That's my version of the hanging gardens. All right. Also in the city of Babylon was the Ishtar Gate and the processional way. It was built about 575 BC by Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, it is significant. When the Jews are carted off to Babylon, the Ishtar Gate is not there. However, it's going to be built while they're there. Okay, we'll see some pictures in a minute of the Ishtar Gate. Rulers of Babylon, we have Nabopolassar, 626 to 605 BC. Then we have Nebuchadnezzar II. That's who he technically is. We just call him Nebuchadnezzar, okay? Nebuchadnezzar reigns from 605 to 562 BC. That is a really long reign, okay? We read about him a lot in the Old Testament. As a matter of fact, he's mentioned 91 times in the Old Testament. Daniel provides a detailed view of this king, okay? So when you're reading Daniel chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, it's about Nebuchadnezzar. 5, we get Belshazzar, and 6, we already get the Persians, okay? Nebuchadnezzar is responsible for the conquest of the kingdom of Judah, which marks the beginning of the captivity period. He's the one that's going to besiege the city of Jerusalem. He's the one that's going to capture the city of Jerusalem. That begins the captivity period. Well, I'm going to say that differently. He takes the first group off in 605, to make absolutely clear here. 597, another group. 586, the third group. That's when the city of Babylon falls. All right? 3 groups taken off. 605, 597, 586. Remember that. Remember those dates. Write them down and remember them. Because someday when you are the contestant on Jeopardy, and that is the final Jeopardy question, and you get it right, and you win $100,000, I'm going to come knocking on your door and saying, see, I pounded those dates into you in class. That's how you won. Share a little bit, okay, with your Bible teacher. Those are the 3 important dates, okay, of the captivity period. It dates to 605 is when the first group goes. All right, so I promised you some photographs. This is the Ishtar Gate. If you want to see that, you will need to go to Berlin, not to Babylon. Don't go to Babylon. Babylon today is in what country? Iraq. Don't go to Babylon unless you're a part of the U.S. military. Then you can go to Babylon. Everybody else stay home. Don't go over there. It's a messy place. So that's the Ishtar Gate. You got to go to Berlin to see it. Notice that guard was very, very, very helpful to me, because he was standing there making sure that no one defaced the Ishtar Gate, and he was great for taking a photo to give you an idea of how big the Ishtar Gate is. It's really, really tall, okay? And by the way, originally it was taller than that, because originally it was taller than that, and when they put it in the Berlin Museum was too short. So what do? We shortened the gate to make it fit. And so that's what they did. They shortened the gate to get it in the museum. So if you get a chance to go to Berlin, go see what's left of the Berlin Wall. Sure, it's cool, it's neat. Go to the museum. That's what's really good about Berlin. There are 2 museums there. There's one on Egyptian archaeology. It's great, okay? But from a biblical standpoint, go to see this one. It's called the Pergamum Museum. That's what we call it in English. The Germans have some insanely long name for it. I don't know what that is, but it's not hard to find. Go and see that. However, check the internet before you go, because they are closing parts of that off and on to reconstruct. So if you're planning to go this summer to Berlin to see that museum, you might want to hold off on that, okay? I got to see that. Looking at my wife, she's going to help me here. We saw that the spring before we moved? Winter before we moved. We went up there with another Czech Christian couple and visited that museum, and I was like in Hog heaven. Okay, I'll just say it that way. I was in hog heaven enjoying that. Okay, this is the processional way, or a lion from the processional way. Basically, if you see those bricks that are kind of broken up, those are original. Everything else is reconstructed. Okay, so you get original bricks and you get reconstructed bricks. They obviously don't find the entire gate intact, but they find enough that they can put it together. This is an inscription from the Berlin Museum, and I really like that lady there in the front of the picture with her back to me. You may recognize her. That is Ivana. I use this picture every time I do this. It embarrasses her to death, but that's okay. That's what being married to me is all about. That is an inscription, believe it or not. It's in cuneiform, which doesn't look like an inscription, but indeed it is. There's a close-up picture of that, and this is what Nebuchadnezzar wrote. I, Nebuchadnezzar, laid the foundation of the gates down to the groundwater level and had them built out of pure blue stone. Upon the walls in the inner room of the gate are bulls and dragons, and thus I magnificently adorned them with luxurious splendor for all mankind to behold in awe. And if you were reading that inscription and thinking, whoa, that sounds an awful lot like Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel 1, 2, 3, and 4, you would be right. Okay? Daniel is a great representation. I mean, he really accurately tells us about Nebuchadnezzar and what he was like. When you read his inscriptions, it was, look what I did, okay? I built the gate. Actually, he didn't build the gate, did he? He wasn't out there working on that. It was all the guys that were told to go out there and work on it, but he paid for it. And he wants everybody to look at this in awe, okay? Because as you go through that gate, you are meant to be impressed with Nebuchadnezzar's power. This is an artist's rendition. By the way, I have permission for all of this artwork that I use, okay? I make sure that I get permission to use these when they're in presentations. This is a representation of the Ishtar Gate and the processional way. So the Ishtar Gate is obviously that big blue gate there in the walls of Babylon. Notice that the walls of Babylon around it are shorter than the gate itself, although they're pretty significant in and of themselves. And then you've got the processional way, which is all of these buildings at the front that have the blue tops on them, and then there's artwork going down, because as you're going through, you're seeing this and you're walking up to the gate. Now, another artistic rendition to give you an idea of scale. If the German guy doesn't help you, these guys will. These are the soldiers, or that's the representation, marching through the Ishtar Gate, okay? The Ishtar Gate is a double gate. Berlin only has part of it, all right? It was a double gate originally. There'd be the outer gate and the inner gate. You had to go through both, okay? The purpose of gates, obviously, was to let people in and out, but I want you to just note that scale up there. How big is the biggest camel you might have? Not that big, okay? So why do you build a gate that big? To impress, all right? To impress. There's a fortification value to it as well, but the real purpose of making a gate that big is to impress you as you come into the city of Babylon. Raise your hand if you've been to Washington, D.C. Raise your hand if you've been to Washington, D.C. A lot of y'all have. What is the first impression you get when you see the Washington Monument? Did you fly into D.C. at all? Do you fly into Reagan? Is that not impressive? Flying into Reagan. The first time I flew up there with Anna, and we flew across there, it was, wow, amazing. I couldn't believe we were that close. That was one of the best views of Washington. The Washington Monument's incredible, right? Then you go see the Lincoln Memorial. It's on the opposite end of the mall. How many of y'all have seen the Lincoln Memorial? That's impressive, isn't it? He's like 20 times life size there. And his speech is recorded around it. It's huge. It's impressive. Why do we do that? Why does the United States spend that kind of money to build monuments? To commemorate and to impress. You come to Washington, D.C., you're a foreign dignitary, an ambassador, you come to Washington, D.C., you should be impressed. That's the purpose of that. Of course, as I always like to point out, what do we in Texas do? We build the San Jacinto Monument, and to make sure that it's taller than the Washington Monument, we put a star on top of it, and indeed it is taller than the Washington Monument. Why does Texas do that? Because we're Texans. That's what we do. Everything is bigger and better in Texas, right? Ivana's chuckling somewhere over there, okay? We do things like that. It's propaganda. That's what the Ishtar Gate is all about. It's propaganda. You're coming into the city of Babylon. You should be impressed with our power. Cynthia? We're going to run with the mic. Caleb's got to get his steps in.
What stone is blue that's made out of? And two, you may have said this, when they found this in Egypt?
Babylon, Iraq.
Was it like this underground? How did they come across this?
There were probably foundations, but a lot of stuff laying around. I'm not real sure how they excavated. It wasn't completely buried. The reason there are so many tiles missing is because they deteriorated over time, and because probably people went and visited with their little kids, and their little kids took pieces of it home. Okay? Things in the ancient world... They had to reconstruct it. I don't think they found halfway of it. Okay? You had another question. What's the blue made out of? It's glazed brick. It's not precious stone. It's just glazed brick. I don't know whether they could... I mean, they'd have to build it out of stone, and they don't have a lot of stone in Mesopotamia, but they have a lot of dirt. And so a lot of mud brick is used down there. So these are probably fired mud brick or clay brick, and it's been glazed to give it the color. Probably yes and no. Because slavery existed in Babylon, but, basically if you weren't from the nobility, you were basically a slave anyways. The king said go and build, you went and you built. It didn't really matter whether you were free or not. So, a lot of manual labor. I mean, this is all manual labor. It's like you go to Egypt and see the pyramids. The Lumpkins just got back from Egypt. They saw the pyramids. Some of y'all also may have seen the pyramids. Slave labor. I mean, it's just, or manual labor, however you look at it. It's labor intensive because you don't have cat heavy equipment to move things. But it's in Iraq today. That's where you'd have to go. And by the way, Saddam Hussein thought of himself as the new what? The new Nebuchadnezzar. He really did. And so he started rebuilding that. So if you go, not that you get to go to Babylon today, but if you were in American military forces that were in Iraq during the war over there, you got to see that. I had a good friend from high school that gave me lots of pictures that he took when he was over there with the American troops, seeing what Saddam Hussein had tried to build, okay? Because he wanted to resurrect the city of Babylon because, hey, if you're Nebuchadnezzar, you got to have your city back, right? Okay, any other questions about that? Was over here? Brenda's pointing at somebody. Was there... Caleb will come.
I was just going to say, from my perspective, having seen the Ishtar Gate and the monuments in Washington, Ishtar Gate just blows them away in terms of impressiveness. For me, I was, like you said, just kind of being awestruck by the size and the color, and they just have a little bitty bit of it. And then when you see the model of what it really looked like, you couldn't help but be impressed. Yep. And then with the lions on the side, you're like, Daniel was right there in the lion's den and all of that. It was really was impressive.
Yeah. The Berlin Museum is not terribly large, but it is absolutely, go see the wall, what's left of it, but go see the museum. Wait a few years, let them get their renovations done, because it's a shame to go all the way over there and find them all closed. All right, so let's keep going. We may fall a little bit behind, we may not finish. We'll see. We'll catch up. All right, final kings of the house of David. Just some things to point out here. Josiah rules from 641 to 609 BC. He is killed at Megiddo by Pharaoh Necho. Okay? Now, what's going on there is they're fighting up there at Carchemish, or they're getting ready to fight up there at Carchemish. The city of Carchemish is under siege. The Assyrians are up there, the Babylonians are up there, the Medes are up there, the Scythians are up there, and the Egyptians say, hey, we don't want any powerful army over here. The Assyrians are considerably weaker, so what we're going to do is we're going to go up there and we're going to help the Assyrians. Josiah says, I don't want those Egyptians going up there and helping the Assyrians. I'm going to help the Babylonians. So he goes out at Megiddo to try to stop the Egyptian army from marching north. Okay? The Egyptian Pharaoh says, Josiah, what are you doing? Go home. God has told me to go do this. Josiah doesn't listen. And by the way, Josiah, there's no record of him asking for God's blessing on that. Okay? He's wounded. He dies. That's significant for the next history of Judah. The Babylonians win at Carchemish anyways. Okay? So now Josiah's dead, 609. Remember, Carchemish is 605. This is 609. This is pre-action to the main battle. Okay? So Josiah's dead. Jehoahaz becomes king, In 609 BC, he reigns for 3 months. He's actually made king by the people. However, Pharaoh Necho says, I don't like this guy that you made king. We're going to take him out. And since we're taking him out, we'll just take him back with us to Egypt. And he does. Okay? That's Jehoahaz. Following Jehoahaz, then we have Jehoiakim. He reigns from 609 to 598 BC. He is installed as king by Pharaoh Necho. He's a vassal of Babylon, however, from 605, when Babylon basically is in control of Egypt, or in control of this area. The circumstances of his death are unknown. Okay, so 609, 598. Then we have Jehoiachin. Aren't these names great? Then we have Jehoiachin. He reigns from 598 to 597, but it's only a period of 3 months. Okay, his story is that he's taken captive to Babylon, and he lives until at least 562 BC. Who else goes to Babylon in 597? Ezekiel, plus a whole lot of other Jewish captives. Okay, this guy goes in 597. We know he's alive in 562 because he is mentioned in Babylonian records. Okay, so we know he's alive at least till then. We don't know then what happens to him after that. All right, so Jehoiachin, he's taken captive to Babylon. Our next king then who is on the throne is Zedekiah. He reigns from 597 until 586 BC. He is the last king of Judah, the last king of the Jews in the Old Testament period. He is a Davidic king. All of these guys are directly descended from David. All right? Zedekiah acts foolishly. He rebels against the Babylonians. Then we have the siege and fall of Jerusalem. Significant for Zedekiah is that the very last thing he sees on this earth is the death of his sons. Because they are captured, they are taken before Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar orders them all executed. And then, oh, by the way, Zedekiah, so that you never forget this, we're going to put your eyes out. So his eyes are put out. He is carried in chains, or taken in chains, back to Babylon. Okay? That's the end of Judah. All right? They're going to come back from Babylonian captivity under the Persians, but they will not be independent until... When are they going to be independent again? Anybody know? Not looking for exact dates, during the intertestamental period. There will be a Jewish monarchy again. It will not be a Davidic monarchy, okay? So scripturally speaking, not a legitimate monarchy, but there will be an independent Jewish kingdom, and you will read about those. We will talk about those in this class in December the 25th and December the 29th, okay? Those are the two classes that will cover that period, all right? So what ends up happening, 605, basically I've talked about all of this. You have them in your notes. See, this is how I catch up because we got like 3 minutes before the bell rings, first bell rings. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, 605 is when they're taken into captivity. 597, that's when we get Ezekiel taken into captivity. Then we have this little item here. This is the Babylonian Chronicle of Nebuchadnezzar. It's a series of clay tablets. They are housed in the British Museum, or this one is at any rate. They record the deeds of the kings of Babylon. This particular tablet that you see in the photo chronicles the years 605 to 594 and includes Nebuchadnezzar's first campaign against Jerusalem in 597 BC. So we get confirmation outside the scriptures of what's going on in the scriptures. Okay? 586, Zedekiah rebels. Jerusalem is besieged and it falls. The temple is destroyed. The houses are burned. The walls are torn down. Babylonians have had enough. These folks have been a pain in the neck for a long time. These Jews have been a pain in the neck for quite a while here. We're going to take care of this. Jerusalem's not going to rebel again. So all of these things happen to the city. Again, Zedekiah's sons are executed. He is blinded and carried off to Babylon, as well as other captives that are taken off. All right, so subsequent rulers. Here they go. Whew. You think those Jewish names were hard. Look at this one. Nergal-Sar-Ezer, or Neriglisser in the scriptures. 559 to 556 BC. He's mentioned in Jeremiah chapter 39 and verse 13. He is the son-in-law of Nebuchadnezzar. Then we have Labashi Marduk. He reigns in 556. He's the son of Nergal-Sar-Ezer, and he ruled for 3 months. Then we have Nabonidus. He rules from 555 to 539 BC. Aren't you glad there's no test on this at the end of class? He stays 3 years in Babylon. Then this fella kind of goes off the deep end, decides he's going to be a mystic. So he goes off to an oasis at Taima, and he's going to live there until things get really bad back in Babylon, and he's going to go back to help his son out, his son being Belshazzar. Belshazzar is co-regent. That's our first bell. He's co-regent from 553 to 539. He's the last effective king. He's actually, however, the prince, the second in the kingdom of the Babylonian Empire. His last night is recorded in Daniel chapter 5. Let me just point this out, that when he wants someone to read the handwriting on the wall, that's the episode, he promises, whoever can read it, I will make number what in my kingdom? Number 3, because that is the best he can offer, because Belshazzar is number 2, because dad is number 1, okay? Even if he was out there at the oasis, Belshazzar gets it right. All right, so, this is the clay cylinder of Nabonidus. We're not going to study that. You have it in your papers. You can look at that. After this time, there's a small population that's left in Judah. Approximately 10,000 total captives go to Babylon in the 3 waves. Those are the dates. Remember those for Final Jeopardy. And win the 100,000 and take me out for coffee. Okay? They are told in Jeremiah chapter 29 to make themselves at home in Babylon because the captivity is going to last 70 years. However, many Jews never returned. It's an interesting thing that we read about the returns in Ezra and Nehemiah. There were a whole lot of Jews who actually had become quite at home in Babylon, and so they stayed. And so up until 1948, our 1948, okay, there was a significant Jewish population in Mesopotamia. Approximately 120,000 Jews living in what is today Iraq. Today there are fewer, sorry for the typo there, today there are fewer than 100. And I would suspect that from the time I made this presentation, even fewer, okay, in Babylon today. But they had been there for a very long time. One thing also, before that bell rings, before I let you go, one thing also to note is when you come to the lecture, see, not if, when you come to the lecture on December the 14th, we'll talk about those wise men that came seeking Jesus. This period is significant for them because these Jews are still out there living in Mesopotamia. How in the world do those wise men know something about a Jewish king? How in the world do they know something about a star that would cause them to pick up and traipse all the way to Judea to find the king? It's because of these folks that were still living out there and kept a knowledge of God's word. Not the wise men. The wise men were not Jews, but they've heard about it from the Jews. All right, that's it for this morning. See, I did not fall behind. We just had to skip some stuff. Next class, that is Wednesday night, we are going to talk about the Jews under Persian rule. All right, any questions, comments before I let you go? I will always try to close the class by the first bell because already people are coming down the hall. That's what we're going to go for. All right, thank you all very much.